Whenever you play Team Fortress 2, you may realize the many drops you get while playing the game. Whether it would be crates, weapons, or hats, there are a myriad of different drops that you may receive while casually playing the game. This may have led you to wonder what the most rare item you can get your hands on is. But on the contrary, what is the most common item, the one almost everyone owns? The most dropped weapon, the most unboxed hat, the most common unusual. There are so many different items, and I plan to take a deep dive into the stats and figure out what the most common item in TF2 is. Let's get a couple of things straight though, because this video would be very quick and easy if I didn't set some ground rules. First, I'm going to be excluding the mercenary, which all players get upon making an account and opening TF2, which obviously makes it the most common item in TF2, but to me, that answer is no fun, so I will continue on. I also want to divide the 3 most common items for each class, then later make a top 3 based off the classes and their drops. Another thing I want to look into isn't just the most common item, but also things like the most common unusual and collector's item. But to finally get started, we will begin with the Scout, whose third most common item is the Bonk Atomic Punch with a total of 2.5 million in existence. The second most common item is the Sandman, with a total of 2.952 million owned, and the most common Scout item is the Force of Nature, with a total of 2.966 million owned. Next is a Soldier, whose third most common item is the Buff Banner, with 2.5 million in existence. Next is the Direct Hit, with 2.7 million owned, and finally is the Equalizer, with 2.8 million owned. Next up is the Pyro, whose third most common item is the Extinguisher, with 2.6 million owned. Next is the Backburner, with 2.8 million owned, and lastly is the Flare Gun, which is the first item to break into the 3 millions at 3.1 million owned. Moving on to the defense classes is the Demo Man, who has an extremely close margin between his top 3 weapons, which all fall into the 2.7 million margin. Third being the Eyelander at 2.701 million owned. Next is the Scottish Resistance with 2.717 million owned, and at number 1 is the Charge and Charge with 2.726 million owned. Next is the Heavy, and his third most common item is the Killing Gloves of Boxing, with a total of 2.5 million owned. Next is the Natasha, with 2.6 million owned, and finally is the Sandwich, with a massive total of 3.2 million owned. The final defensive class is the Engineer, and he is one of 2 classes whose top 3 weapons all pass the 3 million mark. His third place item is the Gunslinger, which has a total of 3.12 million owned. Second is the Wrangler, with a total of 3.86 million owned, and finally is the Frontier Justice, which has a total of 3.1 million owned. Finally is the support classes, and first up is the Medic, whose third most common item is the Blutsauger, with 2.7 million in existence. His second item is the Kritzkrieg at 2.9 million owned, and finally is the Ubersaw with 3 million owned. The Sniper is next, and his third place item is the Razorback, which has a total of 2.8 million owned. Second is the Girardi with 3.1 million owned, and finally is the Huntsman, which stands at a staggering 3.4 million owned. And finally is the Spy, the second of 2 classes whose top 3 most common item all pass the 3 million mark. Coming in at third is the Dead Ringer with a total of 3 million owned. Next is the Ambassador, which has 3.239 million owned, and finally is the Cloak and Dagger with a total of 3.242 million owned. Now for the primary reason most of you are here is to answer the question of what is the most common item in TF2. To start off with, coming in at number 3 is the Cloak and Dagger, which has a total of 3.242 million owned. At number 2 is the Sandwich, with a total of 3.293 million owned, and finally is the most common item in TF2, which is the Huntsman, at a massive 3.4 million owned, which makes the Huntsman the most common item that any class has in the game. You might be wondering, why is this? How has the Huntsman of all items become the most common item in TF2? The primary reason for this, alongside it being a normal weapon drop which has been dropped 1.6 million times, is that it is also an achievement item which has contributed to 1.2 million more Huntsmen to come into existence. But adding this only gets you to 2.8 million. The remainder of Huntsmen come from people buying it from the Steam market, earning it as an MVM drop, and getting it as a Strange from crates. Some other small factors are it being crafted and buying it from store promotions that have occurred in the past. With all these factors taken into account, it has led the Huntsman to become the most common item in TF2. But is it the most commonly found achievement weapon at 1.2 million? The answer to that would be no. It falls with the Frontier Justice, which is just 40,000 achievement drops ahead of the Huntsman at 1.293 million drops. But that doesn't mean these items are the most dropped item in TF2. They are actually far from it. The most dropped item in TF2 would be the Sandwich, with a total of 1.9 million Sandwiches currently existing purely through the random drop system. Which in my opinion is pretty interesting, considering that the most dropped item happens to be one of the most iconic TF2 weapons of all time, including the only item to get its own Meet the Team video. Going further into the rabbit hole, I think it'd be interesting to figure out the most common collector's item, and after about an hour of endlessly going through each class's items, the most common collector's item in TF2 TF2 is a flog, which is the only collector's item in the game to reach over 200 total crafts at 201. Another interesting thing I found while going through all this information was the most common Valve weapon, which if you didn't know are special items owned by Valve employees. So to say common isn't really accurate, but out of all the Valve weapons, the one that exists the most is the Eyelander at 3. And finally, what is the most common unusual in the game? After a bit of searching, I was able to find that it was the Schadenfreude with the Holy Grail effect. There's a total of 550 in existence, but to my surprise, this didn't make it the cheapest unusual by any means, having a price of around 21 keys, which is more expensive than the cheapest unusuals that go for around 4 to 6 keys. Anyways, that's all for this video. I'd like to give a huge thanks to backpack.tf, which is the item database to make this video even possible, and also the thing that sparked this video idea in the first place. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and comment, because it will show me if I should make a second part to this video, as there is still a lot more item categories I can research. Other than that, make sure to have a nice day and stay safe.